Welcome to a journey into one of the strangest and most unsettling stories from the Missouri Ozarks. Before we dive in, take a moment to drop in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I'm curious to know when and where these eerie accounts find their audience. The Ozark Mountains are no stranger to legends, but what unfolded in the winter of 1915 in Shannon County is a chilling mystery that still baffles anyone who hears it. On December 18th of that year, Sheriff Thomas Lawson was called to the Caldwell home, a lonely house perched on a ridge above the Jacks Fork River. Neighbors hadn't seen any sign of the family for nearly 2 weeks. What Lawson found inside has puzzled historians and scientists for over a century. 12-year-old Clara Caldwell was sitting alone in a spotless house with no sign of her parents anywhere. There were no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, no blood, just silence. And Clara, surrounded by stacks of notebooks filled with advanced mathematics and scientific diagrams no child her age should have been able to produce. Robert and Mary Caldwell had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a daughter whose sudden brilliance defied explanation. The discovery of those notebooks turned a missing persons case into something far more disturbing. Researchers who later studied them claimed they contained knowledge well beyond anything Clara had been taught. Some described it as a phenomenon science could not explain, the sudden appearance of information with no clear source. The fragments of evidence we have today come from Sheriff Lawson's reports interviews conducted at Missouri State Hospital No. 4 and scattered academic papers written between 1915 and 1918. Many records were later sealed and others reportedly destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1947. What survives are partial transcripts, faded newspaper clippings, and the testimony of those who met Clara after her parents disappeared. The story that emerges is one of a girl who became the vessel for knowledge no one could trace, and of the terrible cost that came with it. The Caldwells themselves had only been in Shannon County for 2 years before tragedy struck. Robert, a former railroad engineer from St. Louis, inherited the land from an uncle, and the family settled into a quiet life. Robert took on small jobs in the nearby town of Eminence, while Mary sold preserves and quilts at the general store. Clara, their only child, attended the one-room schoolhouse when weather allowed, and her teacher described her as quiet but talented with numbers. Nothing about their lives suggested anything unusual. They were private but not unfriendly, and by all accounts perfectly ordinary, until December 1915, when their ordinary world collapsed into one of the strangest mysteries Missouri has ever seen. Neighbor Hiram Jenkins, who farmed a mile from the Caldwell place, later told the sheriff that the family mostly kept to themselves. They weren't ones to join town gatherings, but Robert would lend a hand at a barn raising, and Mary was known for making the best blackberry preserves in the county. Clara, quiet and bookish, was usually seen with her head buried in a book. Their cabin was small but comfortable for the time, 3 rooms in all with a living area and kitchen. 2 tiny bedrooms, a wood stove for heat, and kerosene lamps for light. Like most in the Ozarks in 1915, they had no electricity, but the property included a barn, a chicken coop, and a tidy garden. Life was simple, steady, and ordinary until it wasn't. Nothing in the weeks before December suggested trouble. No strange visitors, no odd purchases, no gossip of unusual behavior. The last confirmed sighting of Robert and Mary Caldwell came on December 4th when Robert stopped at Wilson's General Store in Eminence. The old ledger, still preserved by the Historical Society, lists his purchases: flour, sugar, coffee, kerosene, and a fresh writing tablet. The shop owner, Elias Wilson, later told Sheriff Lawson that Robert seemed fine that day, maybe a little distracted by the looming snowstorm, but nothing that hinted at what was to come. He'd mentioned Clara's growing appetite for study and her need for more paper. It would be the last time anyone in town saw him alive. 2 weeks passed. That sort of silence wasn't unusual in winter, when deep snow made the dirt roads all but useless. But when no smoke rose from the Caldwell's chimney in the bitter cold, Jenkins grew uneasy. On December 18th, he and Sheriff Lawson set out through the pine woods toward the cabin. Their path crossed the Jack's Fork River by a narrow bridge buried under nearly 2 feet of snow. Jenkins later swore in his statement that from the moment they crossed, something felt wrong. No tracks, no sound, no birds, just a cabin sitting still, as stone as if it were holding its breath. Lawson knocked but got no answer. The door was unlocked odd for such an isolated spot. Inside the cabin was cold and spotless. The stove was dead, nothing but ash inside. A cup of tea sat frozen on the table, abandoned mid-drink. There was no mess, no overturned furniture, no hint of violence or hasty flight. Robert and Mary's clothes hung neatly on the pegs by the door. Their keepsakes, a silver brooch, a pocket watch untouched on the mantel. In the bedroom, the bed was perfectly made boots, aligned neatly by the frame, Mary's brush resting on the vanity with strands of her dark hair still caught in the bristles. It was in Clara's room that Sheriff Lawson uncovered the detail that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The 12-year-old sat at her small desk by the window, alive, but locked in what he called a trance-like state. She didn't speak, didn't move, and seemed to barely notice their presence. The room was filled with notebooks, page after page of drawings and equations. No child in the Ozarks, perhaps no child anywhere, should have been able to produce. Clara's room was the only space in the cabin that felt warm, though not a single stove or fireplace burned. The walls of her small bedroom were covered from floor to ceiling in drawings, formulas, and intricate diagrams. Some were tacked to the boards, others scrawled directly onto the wood. Her desk was buried under notebooks, each page filled with dense writing and complex equations that no 12-year-old from rural Missouri should have been able to produce. Sheriff Lawson, who had only a modest education, admitted he couldn't make sense of any of it. But he knew enough to recognize these were not childish scribbles. More disturbing still were Clara's hands blackened with ink up to the wrists, as if she had been writing without pause for days. When Lawson touched her shoulder, Clara turned slowly, her eyes struggling to focus, and spoke words he later recorded in his report. "They're gone. They had to go. The numbers needed room." Lawson sent Jenkins back to town for the doctor and stayed with the girl. She accepted water but refused food, scribbling endlessly in her notebooks, stopping only when spoken to. Each time he asked about her parents, she gave the same cryptic reply: they had to make room. By evening, Dr. William Hayes arrived from Eminence. His medical notes, later cited in academic studies, described Clara as physically healthy, her pulse steady, her reflexes normal but mentally altered. "The child exhibits a singular focus on mathematical and scientific notation, beyond my ability to comprehend," he wrote. "She answers questions clearly when addressed, then returns instantly to her writing. Most troubling is her complete lack of concern for her missing parents." That night, Clara was taken to the Hayes home for observation, while deputies scoured the surrounding woods and river. They found nothing. No tracks in the snow, no signs of violence, no trace of Robert or Mary Caldwell. It was as though the couple had simply vanished. Over the following days, Sheriff Lawson organized larger searches. Men from Eminence and nearby towns dragged the Jack's Fork River, scouted abandoned mines, and combed through the thick pine forests. Still not a single clue emerged. Meanwhile, Clara remained under the care of the Hayes family. Judith Hayes, the doctor's wife, began keeping a journal of the girl's behavior. Her entries, later entered into the official investigation, paint a picture even stranger than the sheriff's first report. Clara rarely slept at only when food was placed in front of her, and spent every waking hour writing. If she ran out of paper, She wrote on book pages or even the walls. On December 21st, Judith wrote, "Clara filled 7 tablets today with what William says is advanced mathematics. When I asked how she knew such things, she told me, I didn't learn them. They're just there now." She shows no sadness for her parents. It is as if she has forgotten them, or worse, as if their absence means nothing at all. Word of the case spread quickly through Shannon County and soon beyond. On December 23rd, Professor James Morgan of the University of Missouri arrived in Eminence. He had traveled from Columbia after hearing of the strange child who wrote formulas no one could explain. His arrival marked the beginning of a new and unsettling chapter in the investigation, one where the mystery of Clara Caldwell shifted from a missing persons case into something that challenged the very limits of science and human understanding. Professor James Morgan, a mathematician with a fascination for prodigies, traveled to Shannon County, expecting to debunk what he assumed were exaggerated tales about a backwoods girl who had suddenly begun producing advanced mathematics. But the moment he met Clara, his doubts evaporated. In a letter to his department chair, later published in the university's academic journal, he wrote, "What I witnessed today defies rational explanation. This child, with no access to advanced education or reference materials, is generating work in non-Euclidean geometry, differential equations, and theoretical physics at a level that would challenge our best graduate students." Morgan spent 3 days with Clara, carefully reviewing her notebooks. With Sheriff Lawson's permission, Lawson had by then been named Clara's temporary guardian. Morgan brought several pages back to Columbia for review. Specialists from multiple fields confirmed that the material was genuine, and in some cases, even introduced new approaches to problems in physics and mathematics. Yet Clara herself seemed detached from the magnitude of what she was doing. When Morgan pressed her on how she acquired such knowledge, her reply was chilling in its simplicity. "I went to sleep, and when I woke up, the numbers were there. They're so loud now. They needed more room." By the first weeks of January 1916, Clara's case had spread beyond Shannon County, drawing the attention of scientists and doctors across the Midwest. Meanwhile, the search for Robert and Mary Caldwell was reduced to little more than routine sweeps. Locals speculated the couple had either perished in the wilderness or abandoned their daughter for reasons unknown. Neither explanation accounted for the transformation in Clara. On January 12th, acting on the recommendations of both Dr. Hayes and Professor Morgan, authorities arranged for Clara to be admitted to Missouri State Hospital No. 4 in Farmington for deeper evaluation. The admission ledger, still preserved in state archives, described her condition as acute mental alteration of unknown origin, presenting with somnambulistic manifestations. The journey to Farmington was arduous, taking nearly 2 days by wagon and train through deep January snow. Clara, accompanied by Dr. Hayes and Sheriff Lawson, remained calm but wrote constantly. Hayes later noted that during the train ride alone, she filled 14 pages with equations. When asked what she was working on, she answered matter-of-factly, "The motion of the train. The vibrations have patterns. I need to record them." Missouri State Hospital No. 4, opened in 1903, had a reputation for progressive practices. Under Superintendent Dr. Franklin Pierce, the facility emphasized study and classification of mental conditions rather than mere confinement. Clara was placed in the children's ward under the supervision of Dr. Eleanor Reed, one of the few female psychiatrists practicing in Missouri at the time. Reed's meticulous case notes from early 1916 remain the most detailed record of Clara's condition. Her first entry summarized the puzzle patient exhibits: extraordinary cognitive ability in narrowly defined domains, primarily mathematics and theoretical sciences, inconsistent with age, background, or education. Clara's examinations at Missouri State Hospital revealed a baffling contradiction. Physically, she was a perfectly ordinary 12-year-old, healthy and well-developed with no signs of neurological damage. Her reflexes and motor skills were intact, her orientation to people and surroundings was clear, but her grasp of time seemed broken. She often confused the recent past with events that had happened months earlier, and sometimes spoke of memories as though they were happening in the present. What she lacked in temporal clarity, however, she replaced with an unearthly command of mathematics, physics, and astronomy fields she had never been exposed to in her short life. Dr. Eleanor Reed, who oversaw her case, conducted a series of structured interviews. These transcripts survived in the hospital's archives until, according to later reports, they were classified and removed by government officials in 1954. Fortunately, some copies remained in the personal papers of Professor James Morgan, which were donated to the University of Missouri after his death in 1948. One particularly striking interview, dated February 1916, captures the unnerving nature of Clara's testimony. Dr. Reed asked, "Clara, can you tell me how you know the things you write about?" Clara replied flatly, "I told you. They're just there now." When Reed pressed her, reminding her she hadn't known these things before December, Clara answered, "Before the cold night, before they went away." Reed asked if she meant her parents, and Clara nodded. They had to make room. It was getting crowded. When asked what was crowded, Clara paused before whispering, "My head. But it's not just my head anymore. It goes all the way down now. Sometimes I feel it in my fingers and toes. The knowing." Reed asked what happened on that cold night. Clara's voice reportedly grew distant. The sky opened. Not for everyone, just for me. It poured in like water, but it wasn't wet. Heavy like honey, but sharper. They tried to make it stop. They couldn't. There wasn't enough room for all of us. When Reed asked who tried to stop it, Clara became agitated. They did. They put their hands on my head. They prayed. They cried. But it kept coming. Reed's notes after the session reveal her unease. While she considered the possibility of a dissociative episode or early psychosis, she could not reconcile those diagnoses with Clara's intact memory reasoning and astonishing intellectual output. The unsettling suggestion that her parents' disappearance was tied to this infusion of knowledge loomed large, though Reed resisted drawing official conclusions. Through February and March 1916, Clara was subjected to rounds of testing by outside experts. Professors from Washington University and St. Louis, the University of Missouri, and even visiting scholars from Johns Hopkins examined her work. Each arrived skeptical, and each departed shaken. Clara solved advanced equations without needing to show her process, drew astronomical charts that depicted star systems beyond the scope of known discovery, and articulated physical principles that seemed consistent with theory, but extended into realms still unexplored in 1916. Perhaps most unsettling was her ability to assess scientific journals written in German, French, or Russian languages she had never studied. Though she could not read the text itself, she could point out errors in the mathematical formulations as though bypassing language entirely. One researcher remarked, "It is as if she speaks the raw language of mathematics and physics, stripped of human filters." By April, word of the Ozark prodigy spread beyond academic circles. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran a sensational front-page feature calling her Missouri's miracle child. The girl who knows too much. Though the article emphasized her mysterious talents, it only briefly mentioned the unsolved disappearance of Robert and Mary Caldwell. The publicity, however, shattered the quiet atmosphere at the hospital. Dr. Franklin Pierce, the superintendent, recorded in his administrative log that strangers began arriving in Farmington, claiming affiliation with universities, religious groups, and even the military, all demanding access to the girl. By the spring of 1916, Clara's case had shifted from mysterious to deeply alarming. Though most visitors seeking access to her were turned away, hospital records confirmed that on April 22nd, 2 men claiming to represent the Department of War were granted a private interview. No transcript survives, and what was said remains unknown. But in the weeks that followed, Clara's condition began to unravel in ways that terrified those around her. Dr. Reed's notes from late April described the first signs of physical decline. Severe headaches worsening whenever Clara wrote or calculated, and sudden nosebleeds that followed long periods of concentration. By May, her output had slowed. Yet what she produced was described by visiting scholars as even more complex, almost alien in structure. Professor Morgan observed that her work had moved beyond the frameworks of known mathematics into something resembling a new language of numbers and space. Meanwhile, Clara's body was failing. Records show she lost weight rapidly, despite careful monitoring of her diet. Her sleep became erratic. Sometimes she would remain awake for 50 or 60 hours at a stretch, filling pages without pause, only to collapse into a deep slumber, lasting just as long. Nurses recorded that during these extended sleeps, her body temperature dropped unnaturally in some cases to 94 degrees. More troubling still was her change in temperament. Once quiet and compliant, Clara grew irritable, sometimes violently so. On June 2nd, she attacked a nurse who had attempted to remove a stack of her papers for safekeeping. The girl lunged with surprising strength, clawing the woman's face and arms while shrieking, "They're not finished. The pattern isn't complete." It took 2 orderlies to restrain her. Moments later, she collapsed unconscious for nearly 14 hours. When she woke, she had no memory of the attack and calmly returned to her work. That same month, Clara began speaking of visitors who came to her room at night. Staff dismissed this as delusion until Nurse Martha Cunningham recorded a chilling incident in the ward log on June 14th. She had entered Clara's room after hearing voices and found the girl sitting upright in bed, apparently conversing with an empty chair. Clara was speaking in what sounded like Latin, mixed with numbers and strange technical terms. When the nurse entered, Clara stopped, abruptly looked her in the eye, and said with startling clarity, "They're measuring how much is left. It's not enough anymore." No unauthorized persons were found anywhere in the building. By July, Dr. Reed confided in Professor Morgan through a personal letter that her official reports could not reflect. "I am forced to consider whether the very knowledge that has overtaken Clara is consuming her. The correlation between her intellectual outpourings and her physical decline is undeniable. It is as though her mind has become a vessel for something too vast, and her body is slowly failing under the strain." To test her theory, Reed conducted a simple but decisive experiment. For 1 week in late July, Clara was gently prevented from engaging in any calculations. Her pencils and paper were removed, and she was redirected to ordinary childhood activities, playing games, sewing light chores. The results were immediate and striking. Her headaches lessened, her appetite improved, and her color returned. For the first time in months, she seemed like a normal child again. But on the 7th day, deprived of her work, Clara suffered a violent seizure that left her unconscious for hours. When she awoke, she begged for paper and ink with tears streaming down her face. Clara's week of enforced normalcy spent reading novels, playing simple games, and taking walks when the weather allowed had briefly restored her. Her weight steadied, the headaches faded, and for the first time in months, there were no nosebleeds. Yet the moment the restriction was lifted and she returned to her calculations, the symptoms rushed back with greater force. Dr. Reed recorded the unsettling conclusion in her notes. It appears that whatever drives her to pursue this knowledge is stronger than her instinct for self-preservation. When Reed asked Clara why she continued knowing it was killing her, the girl answered flatly, "It has to be finished. They're waiting for it." By August 1916, Clara's condition had grown dire. She was skeletal from rapid weight loss, prone to long spells of unconsciousness, and clearly teetering on the edge of collapse. Yet every attempt to deny her writing materials sent her spiraling into panic so severe that Dr. Pierce feared the treatment itself might destroy her mind. A compromise was struck. Clara would be allowed limited time each day to write under close supervision. It was a fragile solution, one that bought time, but not hope. Everyone at the hospital understood that something had to change if Clara was to survive. That change came unexpectedly on September 7th. A woman arrived at Missouri State Hospital number 4, identifying herself as Elizabeth Caldwell, Robert Caldwell's sister from Illinois. She presented photographs and old correspondence that tied her directly to the family, and hospital staff verified her credentials. Elizabeth, around 40, was described as educated, well-dressed, and outwardly composed, though visibly shaken by her niece's state. She reviewed Clara's files before requesting a private meeting with Dr. Pierce and Dr. Reed. What was said behind closed doors never made it into official records. But decades later, after Reed's death in 1962, her personal diary revealed what Elizabeth had shared. The Caldwell family, Elizabeth explained, carried a dark legacy, what she called episodes. Generations of Caldwells had produced children who, at seemingly random points, developed sudden and inexplicable knowledge far beyond their years. Robert himself had shown signs as a boy, though nothing like Clara's intensity. Most disturbing of all, Elizabeth admitted that 3 other Caldwell children had died before reaching adulthood after suffering from the same condition. According to her, Robert and Mary had moved their family into the remote Ozarks, not for opportunity, but to hide Clara from the scrutiny of doctors and officials who might take her away if she manifested the same fate. Elizabeth's account raised haunting questions. If true, where were Robert and Mary now? Why would they abandon their daughter after years of protecting her? Within days of her arrival, hospital administrators accepted Elizabeth's petition to take Clara into her custody. Dr. Pierce's final report noted her declining health, the letter of guardianship. Elizabeth produced allegedly, written by Robert before his disappearance, and her promise to continue treatment in Springfield. Professor Morgan objected bitterly, arguing that Clara's removal endangered both her survival and the chance to study a phenomenon that might never appear again. His protests were overruled. Clara Caldwell left Missouri State Hospital with her aunt before September ended. On September 12th, 1916, Clara Caldwell left Missouri State Hospital number 4 in the company of her supposed Aunt Elizabeth, traveling by automobile to Illinois. What followed has been reconstructed only in fragments, letters exchanged between Elizabeth and Dr. Reed, scattered notes from Illinois institutions, and a private inquiry carried out by Professor Morgan 6 years later. According to Elizabeth's correspondence, she settled Clara in a quiet residence outside Springfield, under the care of a physician named Dr. Thomas Blackwood, a specialist in nervous disorders. Elizabeth claimed that under his supervision, Clara's health stabilized. Though she never regained her full strength, her periods of fevered calculation supposedly grew less frequent, replaced by stretches of what Elizabeth described as near-normal life. In her final letter to Dr. Reed, dated March 1918, Elizabeth wrote, "Clara has good days now where she seems like any young girl. She has taken an interest in gardening and sometimes goes whole weeks without falling back into her calculations. Dr. Blackwood believes the episodes may cease as she matures. We dare to hope for her future, though we are careful not to expose her to those who might seek to exploit her condition." After this, no further correspondence was ever received. Reed attempted follow-ups, but received no reply. By 1920, concerned for her former patient, Reed turned to Professor Morgan. His independent investigation turned up facts that shattered the hospital's fragile hope. The Springfield address Elizabeth had given did not exist. No physician named Dr. Thomas Blackwood appeared in the records of Illinois or surrounding states. When Morgan dug deeper into the Caldwell genealogy, he discovered that Robert Caldwell had no sister named Elizabeth, no sister at all. The woman who had taken Clara had woven an elaborate deception. From that September day in 1916 onward, Clara Caldwell disappeared from all official record as completely as her parents had vanished from their Ozark cabin. The story might have ended there, but 2 decades later, it surfaced again. In 1938, Dr. Harold Bennett of the University of Chicago, researching the phenomenon of mathematical prodigies, stumbled across references to Clara in Morgan's published writings. Intrigued, he began tracking surviving witnesses and piecing together scraps of documentation that remained. His investigation would form the last known chapter in the haunting mystery of Clara Caldwell, the girl whose mind became a vessel for something the world was not prepared to understand. Dr. Harold Bennett's search for Clara eventually led him far from Missouri to a sanitarium in northern Wisconsin. There he found a patient registered under the name Jane Doe, a woman in her mid-30s who had lived at the facility since 1924. She was nonverbal, spending her days obsessively filling notebooks with strange mathematical symbols, so abstract the staff had long since given up trying to interpret them. The attending physician, Dr. Ruth Crawford, explained that Jane had been admitted years earlier by a middle-aged woman who paid a decade of care in advance and never returned. She claimed the patient was her niece, who had suffered a breakdown after her parents' deaths, but provided no records to verify the story. When Bennett showed Dr. Crawford photographs of Clara Caldwell from her time at Missouri State Hospital No. 4, she immediately remarked on the resemblance, though she cautioned that years of illness had altered the woman's features. What convinced Bennett that Jane Doe was Clara were the notebooks. Their content mirrored Clara's childhood work, but advanced an evolution of the same strange mathematical language she had begun in the Ozarks. Experts later confirmed the writings reflected consistent development, as though Clara had continued her mysterious calculations across decades. Bennett visited repeatedly over the following year, attempting to communicate with the woman. For months, she ignored him, but during his 4th visit, something remarkable happened. She turned, looked directly at him, and spoke for the first time in nearly 15 years. Her words were few, but chilling. "It's almost complete now. They're coming back for it soon." 3 days later, on January 17, 1940, Jane Doe was found dead at her desk. She had apparently finished a final page of equations moments before her death. Dr. Crawford's report listed heart failure as the cause, though the attending nurse described the woman's expression as serene, almost relieved, as if a burden had finally lifted. The notebooks she left behind, 16 years of dense evolving mathematics, were gathered by Bennett. Scholars who examined them called the work revolutionary, a coherent system that followed its own internal logic, yet could not be reconciled with any known mathematical framework. But whatever insights they contained were soon lost. In 1954, government officials confiscated Bennett's materials, including Clara's notebooks. Shortly afterward, Bennett accepted a position on a classified research project. He never again spoke publicly about the Caldwell case, and his unpublished findings vanished into silence. As for the earliest notebooks, the ones Clara filled in her cabin and during her months at Missouri State Hospital, their fate is still unknown. Some may have been destroyed in the courthouse fire of 1947. Others, like Bennett's collection, may have been taken into sealed archives. The final twist came decades later in 1962, when a road crew excavating near the old Caldwell property uncovered skeletal remains. Forensic analysis determined they belonged to a man and a woman in their 30s, who had died sometime between late 1915 and early 1916. The primitive techniques of the era could not confirm identity, but circumstantial evidence strongly suggested they were Robert and Mary Caldwell. Their daughter's fate, however, remains an open question. Was Jane Doe in Wisconsin truly Clara? Did she finish whatever strange pattern consumed her life? And if so, what became of the knowledge she claimed had been poured into her on that cold December night in 1915? The most unsettling aspect of the 1962 discovery near the Caldwell property was not the skeletal remains themselves, but how they were found. According to the coroner's report, the bones had been deliberately arranged in a geometric formation. One investigator with a background in mathematics recognized the pattern as an equation written in the same unusual notation that first appeared in Clara's childhood notebooks. With that discovery, the mystery deepened, but the official record grew shorter. In 1963, Shannon County closed the Caldwell case. The conclusion entered into county records was stark in its simplicity. Robert and Mary Caldwell deceased by means unknown. Clara Caldwell whereabouts? Unknown, presumed deceased. Yet the official closure did nothing to answer the questions that linger. What happened inside that cabin in December 1915? What force or knowledge took root in the mind of a 12-year-old girl? And most haunting of all, what was she calculating across those endless pages? And who or what was waiting for the result? Modern experts who have glimpsed fragments of her surviving work describe it as beyond the reach of current mathematics. Some theorists suggest Clara anticipated elements of quantum mechanics string theory and multi-dimensional models decades before such concepts even entered mainstream science. Others cling to the idea that she was simply a savant, her genius triggered by trauma, her decline the tragic outcome of untreated illness. But this explanation cannot reconcile the abrupt onset of her abilities, her parents' disappearance, or the geometric arrangement of the remains uncovered half a century later. What is certain is that something happened to Clara Caldwell in the winter of 1915. Something that turned an ordinary child into a vessel for knowledge her mind could access, but her body could not endure. Whatever poured into her that cold December night was both gift and curse, burning away the life it had claimed, even as it demanded expression. One relic remains in the Shannon County Historical Society, a single notebook page attributed to Clara preserved under glass. The symbols remain undeciphered by modern scholars, but in the margin written in her careful schoolgirl hand are words that perhaps explain the tragedy. Better than any theory, the knowing wants out. It wasn't meant to be kept inside something as small as a person. For locals, the Caldwell story never faded. To this day, some refuse to walk the overgrown path to the ridge where the cabin once stood. They say the pines whisper when the winter wind sweeps down from the mountains. And if you stop and listen long enough, you might hear it too. The faint, relentless scratching of a pencil on paper, working through truths too vast for human comprehension, waiting for another vessel to carry the knowing. What became of those most closely entangled in Clara's fate only adds to the unease. Dr. Eleanor Reed, the psychiatrist who studied her most intently, remained at Missouri State Hospital until 1924 before abruptly resigning. Former colleagues later recalled that she had grown obsessed with Clara's work, poring over the surviving pages in her office for hours. Dr. Olivia Weston, who replaced her, told a newspaper years later that Reed began suffering headaches and nosebleeds, strikingly similar to Clara's. Eleanor became convinced there was a pattern hidden in the girl's calculations, Weston recalled. She said the numbers whispered when she stared too long. Reed withdrew from public life, settling in a small lakeside cottage near Table Rock Lake. She lived in isolation until her death in 1962. Among her belongings were journals filled with descriptions of recurring dreams. Visions of vast geometric landscapes inhabited by entities composed not of flesh, but of mathematics itself. These journals, along with her research notes, now rest in the University of Missouri archives, silent pages hinting at a mystery that may never be solved. In her final months, Dr. Eleanor Reed's journals turned more prophetic than clinical. One entry written just weeks before her death in 1962 reads, "I understand now what Clara meant. The knowing doesn't want to be confined. It wants vessels, conduits, ways to flow between worlds. We were never meant to contain it." Her words closed a life spent chasing echoes of Clara Caldwell, and they left behind a disturbing suggestion that what had touched Clara was not unique, but something waiting for more conduits. Professor James Morgan fared little better. Though he remained at the University of Missouri until his retirement in 1942, colleagues noted his career stalled as his fascination with the Caldwell case consumed him. Once seen as a rising star, Morgan's work shifted away from mainstream mathematics toward what peers dismissed as eccentric obsession. Former students remembered his apartment as a shrine to Clara's equations, the walls plastered with diagrams and reproductions of her strange notation. In 1938, he published his final paper, Theoretical Frameworks for Nonlinear Knowledge Acquisition in Developing Minds. Though he avoided mentioning Clara by name, those aware of her story recognized it as his attempt to frame her transformation in scientific terms. The academic community scoffed. One reviewer derided it as the mathematical equivalent of ghost stories. Morgan never married, and when he died in 1948 after a stroke, his legacy was largely forgotten. His assistant, Evelyn Hartley, later claimed that among his papers was a sealed envelope marked to be opened in 1975. Yet when researchers inquired decades later, university officials denied any knowledge of such a document. Meanwhile, the Caldwell property itself became a magnet for rumor. After Clara's removal in 1970, the cabin stood vacant for years, slowly rotting in the Ozark weather. By the 1930s, local teenagers dared each other to spend nights there, and stories spread of strange sensations, sudden headaches, dizziness, and even flashes of equations appearing unbidden in their minds. In 1939, 2 boys who attempted an overnight stay vanished for nearly 2 days later, found wandering disoriented in the forest. Soon after, the county sheriff ordered the cabin burned to the ground. The site lay empty until 1952, when it was absorbed into Missouri's conservation lands. Park rangers assigned to the area soon reported malfunctions in their equipment and compasses that spun erratically near the old clearing. A ranger's report from 1955, later scrubbed from public files, described a shimmering atmospheric distortion hanging in the clearing like heat haze, even in winter, shifting in patterns that seemed almost intentional. In 1958, locals watched as helicopters delivered unusual equipment and personnel in military-style uniforms to the site. Officially, it was a geological survey station. Unofficially, no reports were ever released, and within 8 months, the outpost was abandoned without explanation. Residents noted only the silence afterward and the sense that whatever had been studied was never meant to reach the public. The shadow of Clara's case extended even further. Dr. Harold Bennett, the same researcher who tracked down Jane Doe in Wisconsin, accepted a post in 1955 with a classified program later revealed to have been part of the government's exploration of anomalous cognition. Most of its efforts focused on ESP and remote viewing, but scattered references in declassified files mention knowledge acquisition, anomalies, and non-standard information transfer phrases, chillingly close to Clara's condition. Dr. Thomas Hargrove, a physicist who briefly collaborated with Bennett, later claimed in his memoirs that the government had quietly compiled a database of cases similar to Clara's. Nearly all involved children between the ages of 8 and 14. Each displayed sudden bursts of knowledge far beyond their education. And in every case, the brilliance was accompanied by devastating physical and psychological decline. Hargrove's account suggested that Clara was not alone. At least 17 similar cases had been quietly recorded between 1890 and 1950 children who, like Clara, displayed sudden bursts of impossible knowledge followed by devastating physical decline. But hers remained the most extreme, the most meticulously documented, and perhaps the most unsettling. That sense of unease deepened in 1967 when Princeton professor Miriam Lancaster published an analysis of the fragments of Clara's work still accessible in archives. Specializing in mathematical linguistics, Lancaster noted structural parallels between Clara's symbols and mathematical concepts not formally developed until decades later during the 1940s and 50s. More alarming still, Clara's notations did not merely anticipate these theories. They presented them in forms more advanced than what modern science had achieved. It is as if she was not discovering these ideas, Lancaster wrote, but remembering them. Her paper caused a brief stir before fading, either forgotten or deliberately buried. She had planned a comprehensive follow-up, but abruptly abandoned it after accepting a position with a major defense contractor. Colleagues later hinted she was bound by strict confidentiality agreements, and she never again spoke publicly of Clara Caldwell. This pattern repeated for decades. Records disappeared, funding for related research evaporated, and witnesses who once spoke freely grew suddenly silent. By the 1970s, Clara's name had receded into obscurity, surviving only in dusty journals and Ozark folklore. That might have been her final resting place in history, if not for a startling discovery in 1978. That year, Dr. Rachel Norton, an astronomer at the Lowell Observatory in Arizona, was analyzing unusual radio signals from a distant sector of space. Amid the noise, she noticed a repeating pattern that nagged at her memory. Searching her shelves, she found an old journal reproducing one of Clara's equations, and the resemblance was undeniable. Norton confided her findings in an unpublished paper circulated privately among a handful of trusted colleagues. Her conclusion was chilling. Clara Caldwell had not been inventing these systems. She had been transcribing them. She was a receiver, not a source. And whatever was transmitting had recognized her, selected her as a vessel. Norton's speculation remained hidden until after her death in 1994, when her papers entered the archives of the SETI Institute. By then, every direct witness to Clara's story had passed away, their silence leaving only fragments. Her case seemed destined to remain an unsolved anomaly in the blurred boundary between psychology and physics. But in 2014, Clara's name resurfaced unexpectedly. Dr. Michelle Chen, a theoretical physicist at MIT, published a paper on quantum information theory that briefly referenced what she called the Caldwell equations. According to Chen, the equations came from declassified government documents from the 1950s, and they accurately predicted certain quantum behaviors that had only recently been confirmed in laboratory experiments. The revelation sent a ripple through the scientific community until Chen abruptly withdrew her paper and refused to release the source material. She took an unexpected leave of absence from MIT. When she returned 3 months later, she refused to discuss the withdrawn paper or the equations it contained. Under formal questioning by the university's Research Ethics Committee, she claimed to have no memory of writing the paper at all, despite multiple witnesses who had discussed it with her before publication. That same year, an odd collection of early 20th century miscellaneous scientific papers appeared at a small auction house in Chicago. Several researchers who previewed the lot noted it seemed to include original materials from the Caldwell case pages of mathematical notation in a child's hand. Photographs of unknown origin, even what might have been fragments of Professor Morgan's sealed envelope. A representative of the Smithsonian Institution purchased the collection, But before it could be transferred, a court order citing national security interests blocked the sale. The entire collection vanished from public record. In 2019, Clara's shadow surfaced again. During excavation for a new research facility at the University of Missouri, on the site of what had once been Professor Morgan's office, construction workers unearthed a small metal box, sealed in lead and wrapped in waxed canvas. Inside were a journal and several photographic plates. The university initially announced plans to catalog and release the materials, but reversed course within days. Men identifying themselves as from the Department of Energy's Historical Archives Division removed the box. No further information has been released. And so, more than a century after a 12-year-old girl began filling notebooks in an isolated Ozark cabin, we are left with fragments and questions. Was Clara Caldwell simply an undiscovered mathematical savant whose gifts emerged in the most dramatic and tragic way? Was hers an extreme case of a neurological phenomenon, some rare syndrome of sudden cognitive eruption? Or was she something far more unsettling, a receiver for information that does not originate in the human world at all? If so, what is the source of that knowledge, and what does it want from those who become its vessels? The Ozark Mountains keep their secrets well. The precise location of the Caldwell cabin has been deliberately obscured, hidden from public maps, and known only to a handful of state conservation employees instructed to avoid the area. In winter, when the wind threads through the tall pines, locals say you can still feel a presence there, something old, patient, and unfinished. And if you listen closely, they say you might hear it. The faint scratch of a pencil moving across paper, still calculating, still waiting for room.